The difficulties with cults is that once people have been brainwashed for so long, they are unable to distort reality from the fantasy that they have been led to believe for so long.
So we know that Manson showed a degree of affection and empathy towards the girls, but I think this wasn't genuine. I think he was being very manipulative. I think that he knew that these young women were quite vulnerable, and by showing them some kind of affection, they were more likely to believe his lies.
Did you tell the women to do their witchy things?
I said, if you're gonna do something, leave something witchy. Just like I would tell you, if you're gonna do something, do it well. And leave something witchy. Leave a sign to let the world know that you were there. Have a good day. And when I stand on the mountain and I say, do it, it gets done. If it don't get done, then I'll move on it. And that's the last thing in the world you want me to do.
I think Mr. Manson feels that he is a product of our society. He feels that basically it is society's fault that he became enmeshed with the law.
One of the defining characteristics of a serial killer and a psychopath is to abuse power. And they crave power. They have an extraordinary hunger for power.
And you also know the old mythology that says, he who the gods wish to destroy first make mad. He was mad. I think he was out of his mind.
People play games, friend. They lie. What can I do about liars? Are you people going to leave us? I just beg you, please leave us. Bill, we will bother nobody. Anybody wants to get out of here can get out of here. We have no problem about getting out of here. They come and go all the time. I don't know what kind of game. People like people like publicity. Some people do. I don't.
Killing becomes a compulsion. Once you have a taste for it, and the power that it gives you, the power over another human being, the ultimate control to take their lives, it is chilling. Once you get a taste for it, it's difficult to stop.
In my whole life, I've burglarized a grocery store, stole some nickels and dimes, busted open a stamp machine, stole a few automobiles, and cashed a couple checks. I'm a petty car thief. I've been with prostitutes and bums and winos and all my life. Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
Whilst every cult is different and may have different aims and missions, there are some factors that are quite similar. So one of them is the personalities of the cult leaders. Several cult leaders tend to be very charismatic, controlling, and thriving on chaos and power. So for example, we are able to draw some reference between Warren Jeffs, Jim Jones, and Charles Manson in terms of they've all felt that they were leading their followers to a new way of thinking, giving them a higher sense of purpose, but were also very celebrated and godlike, and also thrived off power and chaos, and would indoctrinate them with that to control them.
You've got it stuck in your brain that I murdered somebody. What do you want to call me a murderer for? I've never killed anyone. I don't need to kill anyone. I think it. I have it here.
Charles Manson, one of the most infamous cult leaders in history, whose influence led to some of the most shocking murders of the 20th century.
Manson always persuaded his family to carry out these heinous crimes rather than doing them himself. And I think there's a couple of potential reasons. One could be simply that he thought that the groundwork was beneath him, and as an exalted leader, he didn't have to get his hands dirty. Another reason could simply be risk. Like, he knows that if he's going to try and commit these murders, there's a chance that they might not be successful, that he could physically get hurt. Another element that I wonder about is how deluded Manson was. So even if he wasn't committing the murders, he clearly was inciting them, and he probably would have known that eventually it would come back to him. So I wonder if he was so narcissistic, so grandiose, so deluded, believing that he's Jesus, that he literally didn't care about the consequences of his actions.
Charles Manson never wielded the knife himself, but his power over the family was absolute. Through a mix of charm, fear, and psychological control, he convinced his followers that obedience to him was more important than their own conscience. They trusted him so completely. When he gave the order, they carried out the brutal Tate-LaBianca murders on his behalf. On the night of August 8th, 1969, 4 members of Charles Manson's so-called family broke into a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, a home Manson himself had once visited. Inside was Sharon Tate, a young actress and 8.5 months pregnant, along with 4 friends. Under Manson's orders, the group turned that night into one of the most infamous crimes in American history. They bound, terrorized, and murdered everyone inside. The following morning, news of the killings stunned the world. A crime so senseless it seemed beyond comprehension. The idea that a group of ordinary young people could carry out such horror, not for revenge or profit, but to please a manipulative leader, led the nation reeling. The night after the Tate killings, on August 9th, 1969, terror struck again. Under Manson's orders, 4 members of his family entered the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. Inside, the couple, a well-known Los Angeles grocer and his wife, were confronted by blind obedience and brutal control. Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten carried out Manson's commands, while Linda Kasabian waited outside as the lookout. The LaBiancas were helpless against the total domination of these young followers, showing just how far Manson's manipulation could push ordinary people. What began as indoctrination had escalated to a second night of chaos, leaving the nation horrified and cementing the family's place in criminal history.
Leslie said, in the car on the way to the LaBianca house, you said, this time, make sure they're not scared like last night.
Oh, no. It may have been something like this. I remember something like that, but I don't remember exactly the right words. But that's a simple philosophy from China. That's a Chinese philosophy. Karma. It's a balance of karma.
After the horrific crimes that left America in shock, one question still lingers. What makes a cult leader? Was Charles Manson the product of a broken childhood, or something darker? Is it trauma, neglect, drugs, or the society around them that shapes someone into believing they have divine power? Manson's story focuses us to confront the uncomfortable truth that cult leaders are rarely born monsters. They're made through a mix of circumstance, charisma, and control. His life of instability, rejection, and manipulation created the perfect storm for someone who craved power over others and found it in those desperate to belong.
When we look at Charles Manson's earlier childhood, we know that his mother wasn't very present. She would often neglect him, ignore him. She would spend more time drinking. She would work as a prostitute, a sex worker. So that's quite interesting to me because I think that must have affected him growing up. one thing it would have done is that it would have led him to this belief that his mother is a very sexualized being, and he might have conflated sex and affection, and he might have seen sex as almost like a currency, a means to an end that doesn't need any kind of emotional connection. And also, if he was neglected, if he didn't have the care and the support and the guidance that a young child needs, then it could have made him feel really alone. He could have felt that this world is a dangerous place and there's nobody there to support me. So that could have actually made him quite paranoid.
A child having an absent parent can have profound impacts on their development and their understanding of themselves and other people, and also of how healthy attachments can be. So this can cause them to have an insecure attachment style, which could make them avoidant and fearful of forming relationships with others. It can also form a sense of rejection within them as well, which can then impact their emotional, mental and physical well-being, and cause things such as educational problems and just general negative outcomes in their later life.
At school, that sense of abandonment followed him. Teachers described him as withdrawn, and classmates remembered a boy who rarely mixed or formed close friendships. With no stable family at home and no real support among peers, Manson grew up feeling like an outsider, shaping the resentment and craving for control that would later define his life.
So he hasn't got any close connections to his own mother, and he doesn't have peers, he doesn't have friendships with school friends. So that would have made him quite independent, I think, but it also would have made him quite insecure. So he doesn't feel that he's got the stability behind him.
I think that it's important for us to consider people's life experiences and childhood experiences before we explore their accountability, because what you're exposed to at a young age does influence your understanding, does influence your experience. So I think that whilst there is still a level of accountability, it depends on the type of offending behaviour and it depends on the context.
For Manson, petty theft, truancy, and running away became his pattern. Reform schools, rather than correcting him, exposed him to even harsher environments, beatings, sexual abuse, and a world where manipulation was a survival skill. By adulthood, Charles Manson had spent more years behind bars than outside them. Each institution hardened him further, and each release only pushed him back into crime. Instead of developing empathy or stability, he learned how to read people, how to charm them, and how to exploit weakness. Traits that would later define his control over the family.
There's a well-known phrase, hurt people, or, violence begets violence. And that's definitely something that I see. So the vast majority of the defendants that I assess have some form of trauma earlier on in their lives, whether it's emotional, physical, or sexual.
All psychopaths exhibit an extreme degree of narcissism, and narcissism is a complex phenomenon, but there are certain things that we can say are universal in narcissists, and I think firstly is a grandiose sense of themselves, grandiose sense of their own self-importance, which of course is linked to a great sense of entitlement, that an extreme narcissist will feel extremely aggrieved, homicidally aggrieved in a psychopathic narcissist, that they are being denied what they believe is rightfully theirs. It could be material wealth, but more likely it's going to be emotional and psychological and sexual gratification. And if they are denied that, obviously they will respond calamitously and murderously to that denial. And their narcissism really knows no bounds at all. And another factor of this narcissism is the complete lack of empathy that the psychopath feels for his victims.
They're always in the center of attention. They want the world to revolve around them.
You know, if I wanted to kill somebody, I'd take this book and beat you to death with it, and I wouldn't feel a thing.
It'd be just like walking to the drugstore.
I think a reasonable question is, was Charles Manson insane? Insane, of course, is a legal term, especially when we think of psychiatric defences like not guilty by reason of insanity. I suppose the equivalent from a clinical term, a psychiatric term, would be psychotic. So that's being out of touch with reality. And I think that you could argue that Charles Manson was actually psychotic. He had a number of persistent delusions. He believed in Armageddon, he believed in a nuclear war, a race war, he believed that he was the Messiah. So I think that's quite clear evidence that he had a mental illness.
You feel blame? Are you mad? Do you feel like wolves about for friends? Get friends,
To understand cult leaders like Charles Manson, we first have to look at the psychology of killers, not just what they do, but why they do it. Unlike impulsive or opportunistic murders, cult leaders operate on a different psychological plane. They don't simply kill for greed or revenge. They convince others to kill for them. Their violence is often ideological, fueled by a distorted sense of purpose and ego. Psychologists describe them as possessing a dangerous blend of narcissism, antisocial traits, and delusional thinking. They crave admiration and control, believing themselves to be chosen or enlightened, while showing no empathy for the people they exploit. Manson, for example, saw himself as both a prophet and a performer, manipulating his followers through a mix of fear, affection, and dependency. Drugs, isolation, and repetition became his tools of control, breaking down identities until his followers' only reality was his. What makes cult leaders especially terrifying is their ability to turn ordinary, often vulnerable people into instruments of their will. It's not just their lack of empathy that defines them, but their skill in recognizing weakness and using it. They study human behavior instinctively, knowing exactly what to say, how to look, and how to make others feel special, before twisting that truth into obedience.
She was like a stranger to me, in other words. She was a guest in my house instead of it being her house or our house. She came in like the rest, and there was always someone with her, as if it were planned that way. When I tried to get her to come in with me, she to be alone and talk with me, she'd say, "Oh, I can't. I have something to do with so-and-so," and that was it.
She loved to play, she loved to swing, she loved to play with other children. She had many stuffed animals. She thoroughly enjoyed living like anyone else does.
Understanding this psychology isn't about excusing their crimes, but about recognizing how manipulation, charisma, and delusion can fuse into something deadly. For the Manson family, it all started in Spahn Ranch.
2 years ago, the hippie commune led by Charles Manson moved into this old Wild West film set just outside Los Angeles. And it was here that they were living on the night the alleged murders took place.
At first, life at Spahn Ranch seemed simple. The group spent their days taking care of the property, scavenging food, playing music, and drifting through the desert. The ranch was owned by George Spahn, an elderly man who let them stay there rent-free in exchange for chores and company. The women cooked and cleaned, while some of the men helped maintain the horses and buildings. It was dirty, rough living. no running water, barely any food, but it felt free to the people who had nowhere else to go. They called themselves a family, but in reality, it was Manson who made every decision. The days revolved around him. He spoke for hours about his ideas, twisting religion, philosophy, and bits of music into a kind of belief system. They took LSD often, usually in large group trips that Manson led. During these, he would control the experience, deciding when people could speak or move, using the drugs to break down their sense of self.
When people take LSD, it alters their mood and it alters their perception. And in small doses, it can produce an effect of euphoria. So it's actually, it gives the user a bit of a buzz. In higher doses, psychedelic drugs like LSD can cause depersonalization and derealization. So depersonalization is the feeling that the individual, the user, is not real. And derealization is the feeling that the whole world around them isn't real.
It is likely that Charles used this drug to assist with his offending behaviour, as this drug is often referred to as a brainwashing drug, in the sense that once people take LSD, they are more easily manipulated. It can also increase feelings of anxiety and put them in a state of vulnerability. This drug was actually used in the 1950s by the US militaries to induce prisoners to talk. So this can show that this drug is able to control people, which would have been a huge advantage to Charles.
The group also traveled together, piling into old school buses painted with strange symbols, driving up and down California. They dumpster dived for food, slept in abandoned houses, and relied on strangers' kindness. Manson used these trips to keep his followers isolated from the outside world, teaching them that society was corrupt and that only he could show them the truth.
They seem to live pretty comfortably here.
What do they do for money and what do they eat?
Well, they just as regular as anybody else, and of the whereabouts of the money mostly came from the girls, because the boys didn't work. The girls did most of the money getting.
In the late 1960s, America was already on edge. Assassinations, protests, and racial tension dominated the headlines. Manson fed on that chaos, twisting it into his own apocalyptic prophecy. He convinced his followers that they were living on the brink of a race war, something he called Helter Skelter. The name came from a Beatles song, but Manson interpreted it as a coded message predicting violent upheaval. He told his followers they would survive it, rise from the ashes, and rebuild the world under his command. Inside the family, that idea became gospel. The paranoia, the drug use, and Manson's constant preaching blurred the line between fantasy and reality. Collective delusion felt like truth, and violence began to feel like destiny. By 1969, there were roughly 30 to 35 regular members at Spahn Ranch, though many others passed through. Most of them were young, many still teenagers, and had cut ties with their past lives.
The difficulties with cults is that once people have been brainwashed for so long, they are unable to distort reality from the fantasy that they have been led to believe for so long.
The longer they stayed isolated, the more extreme the beliefs became. Manson preached that society was corrupt and that violence would cleanse the world. By the summer of 1969, his control was complete, and his followers were willing to do whatever he told them, no matter how far it went. He also preached about a race war, a violent conflict he claimed would tear America apart. He used fear and paranoia to fuel his prophecy.
We know that Manson intended on beginning this race war in America. And on the surface, one might think that that's because he held racist ideologies himself, but I think it actually goes deeper than that, because his beliefs were actually that black people would win the race war and that him and his family had to be there as the beneficiary of that whole situation. So to me, there's not any hatred or judgment towards a particular racial group. I think it's more likely that Manson had these paranoid and grandiose delusions, but it was in the context of race being in the background.
He used fear and paranoia to fuel his prophecy. The family itself developed its own distorted traits. Many of them were young, vulnerable, and cut off from any real support system. They lived in a constant cycle of exhaustion, drug use, and emotional dependency. Manson would deprive them of sleep, food, or affection to break their will, then reward obedience with approval or praise. Slowly, they stopped thinking as individuals and started functioning as one unit, always looking to him for guidance. Over time, they lost all sense of right and wrong. Their entire moral compass was replaced by Manson's approval. He told them that ego and guilt were illusions, that what society called sin or evil didn't exist. The more they believed him, the more detached they became from reality. He convinced them that the outside world was doomed, that only their family understood what was coming, and that anyone who stood in their way was part of the enemy.
They're very impulsive, they're very aggressive, they don't care about the rights of other people, and they don't care about the law. And they tend to be career criminals, so they want to offend, but they sometimes regret getting caught.
In a different but equally destructive way, Jim Jones of the People's Temple mirrored this pattern. Though his methods were rooted more in religious authority and promises of social justice, Jones himself relied heavily on amphetamines and barbiturates, his addiction feeding the paranoia and volatility that defined his leadership. For both men, drugs, whether used to manipulate their followers or sustain their own delusions, became central to the maintenance and eventual downfall of their cults.
In the cases that I see as a forensic psychiatrist, it's relatively common for violent offenders to have drug issues, either heavy drug use or even addiction. And sometimes they commit these acts of violence because they're intoxicated and disinhibited on substances. For example, alcohol, cocaine are renowned for doing that. And sometimes they use violence as a way to rob people to fund their lifestyles and their drug habits.
Jim Jones's story began far from the jungles of Guyana, in a small, poverty-stricken town in Indiana during the 1930s. His childhood was marked by loneliness and instability. His father was an alcoholic and largely absent, while his mother was distant and cold, more focused on surviving the Great Depression than on raising a child. From an early age, Jones was left to his own devices. Neighbors remembered him as a strange, intense boy who seemed fascinated by death and religion. He would hold mock funerals for small animals, delivering sermons over their graves, mimicking the preachers he'd seen in church. He didn't fit in with other children and spent most of his time alone, wandering the town or reading about leaders and revolutions. That isolation fed something in him, a belief that he was meant for more, that he understood the world in a way others didn't. By his teenage years, Jones had developed a superiority complex that would define the rest of his life. By his teenage years, Jones had developed a superiority complex that would define the rest of his life. He saw himself as special, chosen, and destined to lead. He became obsessed with power, discipline, and control, often using religion as a tool to command attention and obedience. What started as a lonely child's craving for recognition grew into a dangerous conviction that he was the only one capable of saving others, no matter the cost.
Another tactic that's not used very commonly, but there are a couple of high-profile examples, would be self-incrimination. So Jim Jones, he started a cult and he used this very tactic. This is where he pressurizes and forces new members to incriminate themselves about some element of their past that they're ashamed and embarrassed of. It can be anything from a criminal act that they've done many years ago. And then he uses that almost as a form of blackmail against them, potentially in the future, if they ever speak up against the cult or if they ever try and leave.
People play games, friend. They lie. What can I do about liars? Are you people going to leave us? I just beg you, please leave us. Bill, we will bother nobody. Anybody wants to get out of here can get out of here. We have no problem about getting out of here. They come and go all the time. I don't know what kind of game. People like people like publicity. Some people do. I don't.
From the beginning, he showed traits often seen in authoritarian figures: narcissism, manipulation, and a deep need for control. He believed he was uniquely capable of understanding humanity and reshaping it. What made Jones particularly dangerous was how he mixed genuine compassion with calculated dominance. He could preach equality and love one moment, and rage about betrayal and punishment the next. That unpredictability kept his followers constantly off balance, fearful of disappointing him, desperate for his approval. Jones was also heavily influenced by some of history's most powerful and destructive leaders. He often admired Adolf Hitler, once calling him his god, studying his methods of persuasion and crowd control. He drew inspiration from Stalin's Iron Rule, Marx's idea of social revolution, and Gandhi's image of sacrifice and service, twisting each to fit his own worldview. He didn't just want to lead a church, he wanted to lead a movement. By combining political ideology, religious fervor, and absolute obedience, Jones built a system that looked righteous on the surface, but was rooted in fear and control. His followers weren't just members of a church, they were instruments of his ego and proof of his power. What began as a church built on social justice and equality soon became a world of paranoia, control, and fear. Jones's vision of a socialist paradise turned into a dictatorship, with him at its center. In 1977, he led his followers deep into the jungles of Guyana, promising safety from the corruption of America and a chance to live free. Instead, Jonestown became a prison.
And you also know the old mythology that says, he who the gods wish to destroy first make mad. He was mad. I think he was out of his mind.
By definition, a serial killer is a loner. Whether they have, some of them have people in their lives, some of them may have friends, some of them can get married, have families, but emotionally they're always alone. Because any relationship they have is a pretense, it's a deception. They may appear normal, but they're not normal. They may appear to love, but they can't love. They may appear to be a great and loyal friend, but they're incapable of friendship. And the emotional repertoire of the psychopath is extremely limited. So when we look at the surface of their lives, normality is merely an appearance. The fact is much darker.
Armed guards watched over their settlement. Letters were censored, and anyone who spoke out faced punishments or humiliation. Jones's health was failing. His drug use was heavy, and his speeches grew increasingly erratic, filled with talk of betrayal, loyalty, and death. It all ended on November 18th, 1978, in what would become one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Jones persuaded more than 900 people, men, women, and children, to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid, believing it was an act of revolutionary suicide rather than mass murder. The phrase, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid," was born from that moment, a haunting reminder of blind faith and the cost of manipulation. In many ways, Jones and Manson shared the same foundations. Both came from fractured childhoods marked by neglect, instability, and a deep need to be seen. Both built their power by preying on the lost and the vulnerable, using love as bait and control as the hook. Their lives showed how charisma, when paired with pain and ego, can evolve into something monstrous, and how entire communities can be led to destruction by one man's need to feel significant.
Cults often use love bombing with their new recruits. This is a form of grooming. It's where they find somebody who has quite low self-esteem and they compliment them, they shower them with gifts or with praise. And because these individuals are already quite vulnerable, they're very susceptible to this, and it trains them to feel loved by this new cult. And if they feel that, and if they separate themselves from the rest of society, they're much less likely to want to leave.
But why do people join a cult? From the outside, it's almost impossible to understand. From the inside, it's even harder to see.
When we look at the appeal of joining a cult, it's usually susceptible young individuals who feel that society has failed them or has wronged them in some way. They already feel isolated, they already feel marginalized. So this cult is almost like a surrogate family for them. They need some guidance, they need some support. And on top of that, I think there's also a feeling of safety in numbers. So there's comfort in knowing that they're part of a family, all who think the same things, who have the same beliefs, who have the same values. And I suppose another element could simply be rebellion. It's not unusual for young teenagers, girls, boys, to have this rebellious streak and to like to go against the grain.
Did you go in and tie up the LaBiancas that night? Very simple question.
That night.
August 10th, 1969.
That night. August the 10th,
Did you?
1969.
Why duck it? Why dodge it? Why not answer it yes or no once and for all? Put it behind you.
Did I kill anyone?
Did you tie up the LaBiancas?
We know that Charles Manson seemed to select young women with low self-esteem, and I think this was very calculated. He wanted them to join his family. And this is because being younger, they would have less life experience, and with low self-esteem, they're less likely to question him or to stand up to his advances and his demands. So I think it's actually very manipulative. He's picking out people that are vulnerable, knowing that he's more likely to be able to control them.
Do you miss women?
Certainly. My goodness, yeah, damn right. Yeah.
What do you think of women?
Oh, I like them. Yeah, they're nice. They're put together well and everything, and they're soft and spongy. Yeah, they're nice. As long as they keep their mouth shut and do what they're supposed to do.
Why do you say that?
Because that's what a woman's supposed to do.
Keep her mouth shut and do what she's supposed to do?
Sure.
He actually also convinced his followers that he was Jesus.
Cult leaders generally tend to have a godlike complex, so he may have wanted to be some sort of savior or messiah for them. His own belief may be related to the fact that he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and experienced delusional disorders. So it is likely that he also shared that belief, but he was able to convince his followers due to their own vulnerabilities as well.
This devotion fed into Stockholm Syndrome, where victims form emotional bonds with their captor. Even when Manson subjected his followers to manipulation, deprivation, and abuse, their loyalty only deepened.
Initially, it was used to only describe that situation, a hostage-taking situation, but over time, it's often used in other forms of a power dynamic or other forms of abuse. And the psychological processes behind it are quite hard to understand. It's usually because the situation itself is so highly charged and the victim might feel that they might not survive, that they're going to die, that any small kindness that's showed to them is massively amplified in their own minds as a coping mechanism. So they over-empathize with the actual perpetrator. And in fact, there's even been cases where they have protected the perpetrator in court during the criminal trial.
We then introduced groupthink, the psychological process where individuals silence their doubts in order to conform to the collective. Within the family, questioning Manson wasn't an option. Going along with the group was the only way to belong. This explains how ordinary young people could eventually rationalize brutal murders as acts of cosmic justice.
What can actually happen is that a fairly rational group of individuals can make some very irrational decisions and opinions when they think together.
From there, the story descends into mass hysteria, when fear, suggestion, and shared belief spread so completely through a group that rational thought disappears.
As to the question, are all cults inherently evil? I think you can argue that there are groups, for example, religious groups, that are similar to cults in many ways, and that they have their own systematic belief system and they tend to praise one individual. I suppose almost by definition, a cult has some kind of wicked agenda, whether that is to hurt other people or whether it's to brainwash or commit sexual abuse within the cult itself. So yeah, I would argue that all cults are evil.
Charles Manson was sentenced to death in 1971 for the Tate-LaBianca murders, though his later sentence was later commuted to life in prison when California briefly abolished the death penalty.
Well, I don't think any human being in America deserves to die at the hands of the state. As I mentioned to the court, I think that the death penalty is a relic of savagery. It provides no socially useful function. We don't profit anything by sending these people to their death. The function of punishment in California and elsewhere ought to be protection of society and rehabilitation. Certainly if they get life in prison, and I suggest that if they got life in prison, it would mean life in prison, society would be protected. And certainly they're not going to get rehabilitated up on death row.
Were you happy when you found out you weren't going to go to the gas chamber, Charles?
I knew I wasn't going to go to the gas chamber because I hadn't done anything wrong.
You scared to die?
Sometimes I feel I'm scared to live. Living is what scares me. Dying is easy.
He spent the rest of his life behind bars, unrepentant, still speaking in riddles, still claiming the world had misunderstood him. He died in 2017 at the age of 83, his body frail, but his name immortalized in infamy. Many of his followers remain imprisoned to this day, some still defending him, others finally acknowledging the manipulation that stole their lives. A few were released, older, quieter, carrying the weight of what they'd done and who they once believed in. Manson's death didn't end his story. it only left behind the question that still haunts us. What makes a person follow darkness when it's dressed as light? Are cults evil? Or are they born from something deeply human? The need to belong, to believe, to be seen. Because cults don't begin with violence. They begin with hope, a promise of love, freedom, meaning. But under the wrong voice, that hope turns poisonous. Maybe no one is born evil. Maybe evil is something that's made. And sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to follow.